Chosen One, before I tell you what has been confirmed, I want you to notice something. Maybe you've been carrying a weight you couldn't explain. Maybe you've woken up with a heaviness that wasn't there the day before, or found yourself sitting in silence after praying, wondering why your heart still feels restless. If that's where you've been, I want you to know you're not listening to this by accident. Sometimes a message reaches you only after your soul has become ready to hear it. And I believe this is one of those moments. There is something that has changed. Even if your circumstances still look familiar, deep inside you, where hope has quietly survived every disappointment, something has awakened, the part of you that life tried to silence, that disappointment tried to bury, and that even your own doubts tried to convince was gone, has begun to breathe again. This isn't about waiting for a better version of yourself someday. The moment is already here, and what God planted in you is alive now. So don't rush past what you're feeling. Slow down for a moment and pay attention, because the greatest challenge isn't always what happens around you. Sometimes it is understanding what has already been entrusted to you. A gift that is misunderstood often remains unused, and a calling that is underestimated can be carried far beneath the measure it was created for. That is why awareness matters as much as faith. I want to walk with you through 7 signs that often appear when a chosen one begins to awaken to what God has been preparing all along. Many people recognize several of them immediately, almost as if someone has finally put words to experiences they have never been able to explain. Yet there is one sign above all the others that deserves our attention, because it has quietly caused more chosen ones to question themselves than almost anything they have faced from the outside. Before we arrive there, you need to understand why. The 7th sign doesn't usually appear in public. It doesn't arrive when everyone is encouraging you or celebrating your growth. It shows up in the quiet moments, perhaps in the middle of the night when the room is still, your phone is face down beside you, and the fire you once felt seems strangely distant. Those are the moments no one else sees, when you begin asking yourself questions you've never spoken out loud. The voice that reaches you then rarely sounds loud or dramatic. It often sounds familiar. It knows exactly which memory still hurts, exactly which disappointment still lingers, and exactly where your confidence has grown fragile. It quietly suggests that maybe you imagined the calling, maybe the dream belonged to someone else, maybe you misunderstood everything from the beginning. Those private conversations inside your own heart often become the true place where faith is strengthened, or where it quietly begins to fade. That is why this message calls you to be watchful. The greatest battle is not always against what stands in front of you, but against what you begin believing about yourself when no one is there to remind you who you are. Protect the place inside you where hope still lives, because what God is forming there deserves your attention even when no one else can see it. There is another reason I believe this matters. The fact that you are still searching, still asking, still refusing to settle for a life that feels smaller than what has been placed inside you, says something important. That quiet restlessness you've carried for years is not a flaw in your personality. It is often the mark of a chosen one who senses there is more, even before they can explain what that more is. Place your hand over your heart for just a moment. You don't have to force anything, and you don't have to manufacture emotion. Simply become aware of yourself. There may be a quiet pull inside you, a gentle recognition, or the feeling that something deeper has been waiting patiently beneath the surface. Don't rush to dismiss it. Sit with it for a moment, because by the end of this message, I believe you'll understand why it has been growing stronger. The first sign is that your sensitivity has changed. You notice things other people overlook, and sometimes that can feel exhausting. You leave conversations thinking about what was never said, not only the words that were spoken. You walk into a room and sense its emotional atmosphere before anyone begins talking. If you've wondered whether you simply feel too much, consider that what has been growing inside you may actually be discernment, learning to recognize what your spirit is being prepared to carry. The second sign is that your dreams have begun speaking a different language. Some stay with you long after you wake, leaving behind a feeling you can't quite explain. Others seem to carry meaning that your mind cannot yet translate, even though your heart knows something important was placed there. If you found yourself waking during the quiet hours of the night, don't rush to assume something is wrong. There are seasons when the world finally becomes quiet enough for your spirit to notice what has been there all along. The third sign is more difficult because it often comes with grief. Relationships that once felt natural begin to feel unfamiliar, not because you've stopped loving people, but because you've been changing in ways that are hard to describe. You may still smile in those rooms, still care deeply about the people in them, yet leave feeling strangely alone. Growth sometimes carries the sorrow of realizing that a season has ended before your heart has fully caught up with it. That doesn't mean you've abandoned anyone. It may simply mean God is inviting you to see life from a place you've never stood before. Every change in altitude changes the horizon, and what becomes visible from where you're being led could never have been seen from where you've been. The fourth sign is the quiet pressure you've been carrying inside. Perhaps it's an idea you've postponed, words you've never spoken, a creative work you've kept hidden, or a burden that refuses to leave your heart. The longer you ignore it, the stronger that inner pull becomes. This isn't punishment. It feels more like something planted long ago has finally reached the season where it longs to grow into the light. The fifth sign arrives through small moments that are almost too personal to dismiss. A conversation answers the very question you never said aloud. A passage of scripture seems to meet you exactly where you've been struggling. A door opens only after you finally release the need to force another one. Individually, they seem small, yet together they begin forming a pattern, gently reminding a chosen one that even in seasons that once felt silent, they were never walking alone. Those moments of confirmation are more than coincidences. They arrive with a kind of precision that is difficult to ignore, almost as if each one quietly points you in the same direction. A conversation answers the question you never spoke aloud. A passage of scripture meets you exactly where you've been struggling. A door opens only after you've finally released the one you kept trying to force. One moment by itself might seem ordinary, but together they begin telling a story your heart recognizes long before your mind can explain it. The sixth sign is quieter than the others. It shows up in the way you watch your own thoughts now. You're becoming aware of the stories your mind automatically repeats, and before those old patterns can carry you too far, something within you gently calls you back. You're beginning to notice what gives you peace, what slowly drains your spirit, what draws you closer to your calling, and what only fills your life with noise. This isn't simply learning better habits. It feels more like God is patiently restoring rooms inside your heart that have been closed for far too long, making space for what has been waiting to grow. Then comes the seventh sign, the one I asked you to remember from the beginning. More chosen ones have stumbled here than almost anywhere else, not because of what happened around them, but because of what quietly happened within them. It arrives in the middle of growth, in the middle of answered prayers, in the middle of becoming someone new. And suddenly, without warning, everything feels painfully ordinary again. The fire that felt so alive yesterday seems distant today. You sit with the same calling that once filled you with hope, yet all you feel is silence. You wonder whether you misunderstood everything, whether your faith simply wanted something so badly that it imagined the whole story. The distance between what God placed in your heart and what your life currently looks like can feel almost impossible to cross. If you've ever lived in that space where your heart carries more than your circumstances seem able to hold, take a moment and type 444 in the comments, not because a number has power on its own, but because sometimes it's healing to realize you're not the only chosen one who has walked through this valley. David knew this feeling well. When Samuel came searching for Israel's future king, David wasn't standing proudly beside his brothers. He was still in the field, tending sheep when no one expected history to find him. It would have been easy to mistake that hidden place for rejection, yet heaven saw it as preparation. The field wasn't evidence that he had been forgotten. It was exactly where he needed to become the man God already knew he was. When David finally stood before Samuel, there was nothing about his appearance that suggested a throne. He smelled like the field, his hands carried the ordinary work of an unnoticed shepherd. Yet the prophet looked beyond what everyone else could see and declared, "This is the one." That moment changed David forever, even though almost nothing around him changed at all. After he was anointed, David returned to the same sheep, the same hillsides, the same quiet routine that had shaped his life. The palace did not appear overnight. The applause didn't come. But something inside him had already crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. His identity had shifted long before his circumstances did. That is why Goliath appeared after the anointing instead of before it. The battle wasn't meant to stop an ordinary shepherd. It became the place where the strength God had already formed within David would finally be revealed. The pressure did not cancel the promise. It uncovered it. Perhaps that's why your own journey feels so confusing right now. You sense something expanding inside you while your outward life still seems unchanged. At times you feel stronger than you've ever been, yet strangely more vulnerable. Those two experiences can exist together. They are not signs that something has gone wrong. They often belong to the same season. This is what it looks like to live in the field before the palace. It is the quiet season between being called and being seen, between receiving the promise and watching it unfold. Many chosen ones mistake this season for delay when, in reality, it is the place where endurance becomes part of who they are. And if you're here now, you're likely much closer than you realize to the next chapter God has been preparing. One truth many people never hear is that the moment something awakens inside you often becomes the moment your faith is tested most deeply. Not because God has stepped away, but because growth always asks something of you. When nothing was stirring inside you, it was easy to remain where you were, but once the gift begins pressing toward expression, every old fear, every old doubt, and every old story about who you are suddenly asks to be believed again. That is why this season calls for awareness instead of fear. Guard your heart. Pay attention to what you repeatedly agree with in private. The life God is building within you deserves your care, your honesty, and your willingness to keep showing up, even on the days when nothing seems to be changing. There is something else I want you to understand before we go any further. The years you spent waiting were never empty years. They were the years when your roots were growing, where no one could see them. What looked like delay was often depth, and what felt like disruption was quietly becoming stability beneath the surface. The Hebrew word, often translated as planted, carries a deeper picture than we usually imagine. It speaks of something driven firmly into the ground, secured with intention until it cannot easily be moved. That image changes the way we see our own story. God wasn't scattering possibilities and hoping one would survive. He was establishing something deep enough to endure storms you couldn't yet see. Every disappointment, every closed door, every relationship that unexpectedly ended, every season where someone else seemed to move ahead while you remained where you. None of it was meaningless. Those moments were stretching your roots deeper than you realized. Lives built for lasting purpose are rarely formed close to the surface. So when you look back now, perhaps you no longer need to apologize for the years that seemed delayed. They were never wasted. They became the hidden foundation beneath everything still to come. Rare things almost always take longer to grow because they are being prepared to carry a weight that ordinary roots could never sustain. Joseph lived inside that mystery for years. He carried a dream long before he understood its timing, and there were seasons when every circumstance seemed to contradict what God had spoken to him. Prison did not resemble purpose. Waiting did not resemble favor. Yet those hidden years were quietly shaping a man who would one day carry responsibility far greater than his younger self could have imagined. When Joseph's moment finally arrived, it changed far more than his own life. The years of pressure had given him roots deep enough to hold the blessing that followed. The waiting had not delayed God's promise. It had prepared Joseph to survive it. Esther's story carries the same quiet truth. She spent years living in a place that seemed disconnected from the reason she had been born. Day after day probably felt ordinary, even confusing, until one sentence brought everything into focus. For such a time as this, she hadn't wandered into that season by chance. Long before she understood her purpose, she had already been positioned for it. Perhaps that's true for you as well. The seasons that felt hidden may have been the very places where your calling was taking shape beneath the surface. Those quiet years were never punishment. They were preparation, and now, when you look back, you may begin to see that every unseen root was growing strong enough to carry what is still ahead. There is something I want to say to those of you who have quietly carried the weight of being a cycle breaker. If that description has always stirred something inside you, this part is especially for you. What you've been carrying has probably felt larger than your own life, and maybe you've never found the words to explain why. The pressure has often seemed out of proportion to your circumstances because your story has never been only about you. Sometimes I wonder if the prayers that shaped your life began long before you ever took your first breath. Perhaps someone before you cried out for freedom they never lived long enough to see. Perhaps they asked God to change what had repeated through generations, without realizing that part of the answer would one day be entrusted to someone like you. If that is true, then your journey carries echoes of prayers that reached heaven years before your name was ever spoken. That is why your awakening feels so significant. What God is growing inside you reaches beyond your own future and quietly touches the generations that will come after you. Every step toward healing, every pattern that ends with you, every choice made in faith creates a different inheritance than the one you received. The weight you've carried begins to make more sense when you realize it has always been connected to something much larger than a single lifetime. So don't measure your life only by what you can currently see. The roots God has been growing beneath the surface were never meant to support a shallow purpose. They have been driven deep because they were created to carry something that required strength long before it required visibility. What feels hidden today may simply be the foundation for something your eyes cannot yet fully imagine. Now let's become more specific about what has been awakened inside you. Spiritual language can sometimes become so familiar that we stop feeling the weight of what it actually means. Words like anointing can begin sounding abstract, yet their original meaning was deeply personal. They pointed to someone being intentionally set apart for a purpose that belonged uniquely to them. When God anoints a person, He is doing far more than giving them a powerful emotional experience. He is entrusting them with a responsibility that fits the way they were created. It is not about becoming someone else. It is about becoming fully alive as the person He has been forming all along. What has awakened inside you is not a passing feeling that comes and goes with your emotions. It is a capacity that has quietly existed beneath the surface, waiting for the right season to emerge. The first thing many chosen ones begin noticing is a different kind of knowing. It doesn't always arrive through long explanations or careful analysis. Sometimes truth settles into your spirit before your mind has caught up with it. You sense when something is right, when something feels out of alignment, or when someone standing in front of you needs compassion more than advice. For years you may have questioned those impressions because they couldn't always be explained, yet God often speaks to the heart before He satisfies the intellect. That doesn't mean every feeling becomes truth. It means your spirit is learning to recognize the gentle ways God has always been leading you. Discernment grows through relationship, and over time you begin recognizing His peace with greater confidence than your own fear. What once felt confusing gradually becomes familiar because your heart is learning His voice. The second thing that begins to awaken is your creative intelligence. This reaches far beyond art or talent. It is the ability to see possibility where others only notice obstacles, to recognize connections that seemed unrelated, and to discover hope where everyone else expected another ending. There are moments when an unexpected idea arrives in the quiet of the morning, and somehow it untangles questions that have followed you for months. Those moments often feel less like invention and more like receiving. Many people spend years believing they have nothing remarkable to offer because they compare themselves to someone else's gifts. Yet creativity has always been one of God's ways of revealing solutions through ordinary people. What He places in your heart may become exactly what someone else has been praying to find. The third thing that begins to grow is your influence. Not the kind measured by attention or recognition, but the quiet ability to change the atmosphere simply by the way you carry yourself. Have you ever noticed that people sometimes tell you things they've never shared with anyone else, or that conversations seem to become more honest when you're present? Those moments are rarely accidental. There were seasons when pain buried that gift beneath disappointment and uncertainty. You may have doubted whether you had anything meaningful left to give because your own heart was still healing. Yet the gift never disappeared. It was simply waiting beneath the surface, growing stronger while you were becoming stronger. Take a slow breath here before we continue. You don't have to rush through every word or force yourself to understand everything immediately. Sometimes the deepest truths need a little silence before they become part of you. Let this moment settle without trying to explain it. The fourth thing that begins to awaken is authority, and authority is very different from striving. You can spend years exhausting yourself trying harder, while the same patterns quietly repeat themselves. Then something shifts inside you. The choices you make begin carrying a different weight because they now flow from a different identity. Authority doesn't promise a life without challenges. David still faced Goliath. The difference was that he no longer looked at the giant through the eyes of fear. He looked at the battle through the confidence of the one who had called him. That changed everything. You'll also begin noticing that your private words carry more influence than you once realized. The conversations you have with yourself when no one else is listening begin shaping the direction of your life. Chosen ones who grow into spiritual maturity become careful with those words, not because they fear saying the wrong thing, but because they understand that what they continually agree with eventually becomes the atmosphere they live in. David learned that lesson long before he ever wore a crown. In lonely fields where no audience applauded him, he filled the quiet with songs that reminded his own heart who God was. Those private moments became the foundation for the public courage the world would one day remember. So be intentional with the words you speak over your own life today, especially in the hidden places where no one else hears them. The field has always mattered just as much as the palace, because it is in the hidden seasons that identity grows strong enough to carry the future. Speak with the quiet confidence of a chosen one who knows the one who first spoke purpose over them. This is the moment where the words, "Be careful," begin to carry a different meaning. They are not meant to fill you with fear. They are meant to awaken your awareness. Everything we've talked about, your discernment, your creativity, your influence, the quiet authority growing inside you, can only flourish when you continue making room for what God has already begun. Even the strongest gift grows dim when it is buried beneath constant noise. Many chosen ones spend years believing something has gone wrong with them, when the truth is often much quieter than that. Life has a way of covering what God planted beneath layers of disappointment, distraction, exhaustion, and the pressure to simply survive. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens little by little until one day you realize you've been living with less peace than you once knew, less clarity than you once carried, and less expectation than your heart was created for. That doesn't mean your calling disappeared. It doesn't mean God withdrew what He entrusted to you. What He planted remains where He placed it. Sometimes it simply waits beneath the weight of everything you've had to carry, patiently waiting for the moment you become still enough to recognize it again. Think about the child you once were, before life became so complicated, before every decision carried pressure, before disappointment taught you to protect your heart. There was a freedom in the way you imagined, trusted, created, and noticed beauty. That part of you was never truly lost. It has simply been covered by years of responsibility, noise, and the instinct to survive. Perhaps that is why your spirit has felt so restless lately, not because something is missing, but because something deep within you has been asking to breathe again. The clarity you've been longing for isn't always found by striving harder. Sometimes it begins when you create space for the voice of God to become louder than every other voice you've learned to live with. The gap you've been feeling between what God placed in your heart and what your life currently reflects is not always evidence that you've failed. Many chosen ones mistake weariness for distance from God. They mistake emotional exhaustion for spiritual defeat. Yet those are not the same thing. Your soul may simply be inviting you back into a place of quiet where what has always been true can finally be heard again. If this speaks to something you've quietly been carrying, type "activated" in the comments. Let it be your way of saying, "I recognize this season. I recognize that something inside me is beginning to awaken again." So receive the warning as an invitation instead of a burden. Guard your attention. Protect your peace. Be intentional about what you allow to shape your thoughts and your heart. Every day you choose what you will repeatedly listen to, what you will continually believe, and what voice you will ultimately trust. Give God room to restore what the pressures of life have slowly crowded out. Let Him uncover what never stopped living beneath the surface. The gifts He planted in you have not expired. The wisdom, the discernment, the compassion, the courage, and the quiet strength you've questioned were never abandoned. They have been waiting for a heart willing to receive them again. And that brings us back to what we've been building toward from the beginning. What you're carrying is not a burden you were left to manage on your own. It is a commission. There is a profound difference between those two realities. A burden convinces you that everything depends on your strength. A commission reminds you that the one who called you is also the one who continues to sustain you. Everything changes when you begin seeing your life as a commission instead of a burden. A burden convinces you that everything depends on your own strength, that you must carry every unanswered question and every impossible expectation by yourself. A commission is different. It reminds you that if God entrusted you with an assignment, He also prepared you with the grace, the strength, and the capacity needed to walk through it, even before you understood what your life would require. The difference is not found in how difficult the journey becomes. It is found in whether you trust the one who called you. A chosen one often spends years wondering if they are enough, when the deeper invitation is simply to believe that God has never sent anyone into their purpose empty-handed. The one who began the work has never stopped sustaining it. You were chosen long before you understood your own story. The seasons that looked like loss were shaping parts of you that success never could. The waiting, the hidden years, the disappointments that seemed impossible to explain were never outside His awareness. Even when you couldn't see the purpose, He was quietly building depth beneath the surface. What God planted in you has never been forgotten. The same hands that formed your calling are still holding it today. You don't have to wait until your circumstances finally agree before you receive what God has already spoken over your life. Faith often begins long before visible evidence arrives. So stop measuring your identity by today's circumstances alone. You are allowed to carry what God has entrusted to you without apologizing for its size. You are allowed to become the person He has been patiently shaping, even if that growth makes some places feel too small and some relationships begin belonging to another season. There may be people who never fully understand what God is doing in your life, and perhaps they were never meant to. Not every season can be explained while you're living through it. Some chapters only make sense when you look back and realize God was writing a story far greater than the one you could see at the time. I want to tell you about someone whose journey reminds me of that truth. For nearly 9 years, he carried a vision that refused to leave him. He prayed over it, wrestled with it, took faithful steps whenever he could, and still it remained just beyond his reach. There were days he wondered whether the dream had been too big, or whether he had misunderstood it altogether. Then, almost quietly, something shifted. He didn't describe it as striving harder or finally discovering the perfect strategy. He described it as if a door inside him had slowly opened after years of standing before it. What had remained unfinished for so long suddenly began to flow, and in a matter of weeks, the work he had carried for years finally found its expression. Looking back, he realized the waiting had never been empty. Those hidden years had taught him patience, humility, and endurance before they ever produced visible results. Sometimes God prepares the person long before he reveals the work. What feels like delay often becomes the very reason you're able to carry what eventually arrives. Perhaps you are standing near a doorway like that yourself. You don't have to force it open by fear or exhaustion. Continue making room for God to strengthen what He has already placed inside you. Receiving help, embracing wisdom, and caring for the life you've been entrusted with are not signs of weakness. They are acts of faithful stewardship, and now everything we've talked about gently leads us here. Not to an ending, but to a quiet moment where truth has room to settle into your heart. Before we move any further, simply become still for a moment. Let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts become quiet enough to hear what your spirit has been carrying all along. Father, we come before you without trying to impress you, and without pretending to have everything together. You have been present from the very beginning of this journey. Long before these words were spoken, you already knew the person listening today. You have watched every hidden season, every unanswered prayer, every moment of waiting, and every silent act of faith that no one else ever saw. You know the weight they have carried to reach this moment. You know the mornings when hope felt distant, the prayers that seemed to disappear into silence, the relationships that ended before they were ready, and the dreams that appeared to fade just before they came into reach. Nothing has been hidden from you, and nothing has been wasted. So today we choose to release what never truly belonged to us. We release the opinions of people who spoke over our lives without understanding what you were doing. We release the pressure to prove our calling before its time. We release the shame of comparing our journey to someone else's timeline. We place all of it into your hands, trusting that what you have planted will continue to grow in the season you have already prepared. Release the fear that you've already missed your moment. Release the quiet comparisons that convinced you someone else's journey somehow diminished your own. Let go of the shame from those seasons when even you couldn't explain what God was doing because you were still living inside the process. Some chapters are impossible to understand while you're walking through them, and that has never meant they were without purpose. Release the pressure to prove your calling before you've had the chance to live it. Release the fear of what might change once you stop making yourself smaller just to keep other people comfortable. Release every voice that told you this kind of life belonged to someone more qualified, someone with fewer failures, fewer regrets, or a keener story. God has never measured your calling by the standard people tried to place over you. Let go of the habit of shrinking the gifts God placed inside you so that everyone else can remain comfortable. Let go of explaining yourself to people who have never carried what you've carried or walked where you've walked. Most of all, release the version of yourself that learned to survive by staying hidden. That version protected you for a season, but it was never meant to become your permanent home. What helped you survive the wilderness is not what will carry you into the promise. There comes a moment when survival quietly gives way to trust. And I believe many of you are standing in that moment now. So allow what no longer belongs to this season to fall away. You don't have to cling to yesterday's fears while God is inviting you into tomorrow's faith. As I pray, I want you to simply listen with an open heart. If these words resonate with your spirit, receive them with peace. Father, thank you for every hidden year that seemed confusing while you were quietly building strength beneath the surface. Thank you for every delay that became deeper preparation, every closed door that redirected a life, and every season of silence that was never empty in your hands. You have never abandoned what you began. I believe you are reminding someone today that you did not place this calling inside them by accident. You did not awaken hope only to leave it unfinished. Every unseen root that grew during years of waiting has become the very thing that will hold what is still to come. Nothing has been wasted, and nothing has been forgotten. For the one listening who has questioned whether they arrived too late, let peace replace that fear. The season they thought they missed may be the very season they are standing in now. The wisdom they have been gathering, the compassion formed through hardship, the creativity that has quietly waited for expression, and the relationships prepared with purpose are not behind them. They are unfolding one step at a time. You are the God who calls, who forms, and who faithfully completes what you begin. What you planted deep within this chosen one has been held securely through every storm, every disappointment, and every season that seemed uncertain. Your purpose has remained steady, even when their confidence has not. So let this truth settle deeply today. You don't have to become someone else before you can begin walking in what God has already spoken over your life. You are invited to receive His grace now, to trust Him now, and to move forward one faithful step at a time. The person listening to these words is already changing, often in ways they cannot yet fully see. If something in this message met you exactly where you are, let your light be your quiet agreement, not simply as a response to these words, but as an act of faith that someone else may encounter this same encouragement at the moment they need it most. There may be another chosen one sitting in the middle of doubt tonight, wondering whether the fire they once carried has gone out. If someone comes to your heart as you hear these words, send this message to them. They may never tell you how deeply they needed it, but your willingness to share it could become the reminder that helps them keep going through a season they thought they had to face alone. And as we come to the end, don't rush away. Sit with what has settled in your spirit. Identity rarely changes in moments of noise. More often it changes in quiet moments like this, when truth finally becomes personal. God has not brought you this far simply to leave you where you are. He has been faithful from the very beginning, and He remains faithful now. So go forward with quiet confidence. Walk as the chosen one. He has been forming through every hidden season, every unanswered question, and every step of the journey. You are not simply leaving this message. You are leaving a season.